welcome to We Never Met, the podcast where I have interesting strangers on every single week. Today we have Rob Brennan. Did I say that right?
You did. Hey.
Awesome. There we go. Off to a good start. Of Supermoon Beer Company. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. This is cool. I love the idea.
I guess just to start off, to give people an idea of what you do, can you explain a little bit about Supermoon Beer Company? And because it started fairly recently, right?
Yeah, I mean, the start date is sort of an interesting topic on its own. We've sold our first beer officially November of 2020.
Okay.
The kind of ramping up to that point was probably like 2 years in the works from a production standpoint and licensing and all that good stuff. But yeah, we're a small family-owned brewery here in the Bayview community of Milwaukee. And we focus on what I call rustic, funky, and barrel fermented beers mostly. And we could probably get into what exactly that means and why. But we're not out to make the next great IPA or anything like that. We have a pretty specific focus on mixed and alternative fermentation, oak barrel fermentation, and blending.
Yeah, because you talk about that ramp up sort of period to starting the brewery. Okay, what was the initial thought that you had that you wanted to start your own brewery? Because you had worked in the beer industry, but when did that thought come to you specifically of like, I want to go out on my own? Because I mean, that's a scary, hard thing to do, to start your own brewery. So when did that thought come to you?
Yeah, not made any easier by doing it during a pandemic, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the idea has been around for a while. I think it's not an uncommon story for people that start home brewing at some point to either have the thought themselves of opening their own brewery or for their friends who are drinking their free beer to encourage them to open a brewery. It's kind of a rising tides. Raises all ships sort of a push. But the actual point where it started to become a real conversation between my wife and I was when we moved back to Milwaukee from Chicago. So she and I met here. We went to Marquette together. We lived in Chicago for about 10 years and made our way back to Milwaukee just to kind of replant our roots and try something new, change of pace. And we were looking for a home to live in on this side of town. I've got a guest attached to me. He's down for his first podcast. We were looking for a place to live, and we totally fell head over heels for Bayview. My brother-in-law and his wife live here, and they are very good friends of ours, and so we were visiting quite a bit. Knew we wanted to be on this side of town, and we found this building that was really unique, and it's a mixed-use commercial residential building. And at the time, we had just thought that we were going to live in one of the apartments in it, and then kind of fix it up and just live there. It's across the street from Humboldt Park, and it was a nice little corner of the neighborhood, and we just liked it. And then we found out that it was zoned to be a whole list of things, probably like, there was like 100 things that it was zoned for. And one of them was a microbrewery that produces less than 5,000 barrels of beer a year, which I don't even think I'll make 5,000 barrels of beer a year. But the point is, I was like, wow, this is a thing. And initially, my reservations were kind of what they had always been, which is like, it's kind of crazy to start a brewery, right now in this market and all this stuff. And my wife was kind of like, you're going to tell me that we ended up in a building that can be this and we're not going to pursue it. So she really kind of like pushed it to the forefront. And yeah, we kind of started the conversation and kind of putting a business plan together and thinking it through and going for it. And that was probably like spring of 2019 and early 2019. And we pursued licensing and actually had a relatively sort of comparatively quick approval process with the federal government and the state to get our brewing licenses. So we started building a brewery around that. Wow.
Did you guys end up living in the top part or no?
We did. Yeah. We lived there for like a year, and I just sort of we didn't have Walt at the time, our son. So I spent a lot of the nights just kind of working on the brewery and getting beer in barrels and starting to pitch these barrels with certain microorganisms that I wanted to start playing around with and getting that process out of the way. sort of a long way of explaining that the beer that I make isn't traditional ale fermentation. So the fermentations that I kind of facilitate in our brewery are much longer, slower fermentations with wild and cultured wild Brettanomyces strains. So they take, anywhere from 3 to 6 to 9 months, all the way up to like 18 months in some cases to ferment out and get the character that we're looking for. So compared to a traditional like 14-day fermentation on the clean side, my beers take much longer periods of time. So there was a much longer sort of ramping up production wise.
So I guess with that, is it a tougher market because there's just like, if you're fermenting something for 18 months, is the margin for error very slim? Because if that goes off like at some point, I mean, that's, you waited for so long to get that out, Totally.
You're right. And one of the sort of built-in sort of logistic concerns or challenges rather is I have to account for that. So I plan for a certain amount of waste because I'm dealing with a lot of things that are entirely out of my control. I basically set up a fermentation and then let the environment sort of take over from there with the yeast and whatever was living in the barrel before I got it. So there's a whole bunch of things microscopically that I'll never know. And sometimes things don't go well. I mean, all I can do is really manage cellar conditions. So I'm pretty dialed into my cellar temperature and humidity and temperature swings. And even, just knowing that my top racks of barrels have like a 6 to 10 degree temperature swing from the bottom. I can kind of play around with some of the variables, but once the unfermented beer hits the barrel and the yeast start doing their thing, I'm kind of out of the process at that point. I just monitor them, taste them, and that's where kind of blending starts to take hold. But in this world of this style of beer making, there's a very sort of a strict and tried and true shit in, shit out policy. Where once it starts kind of going bad or a certain souring bacteria takes over, there's not really a lot you can do, and you're better served just dumping it down the drain.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because is there a specific brewery that you went to or beer that you had that introduced you to like this sort of style? Because I haven't really seen, at least in Milwaukee or breweries across the United States, like people that are doing stuff with wild yeast as much and things like that. So what inspired you to get into this style specifically?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of coming up as a focus for a lot of breweries, but a lot of people are pretty hesitant to get into it because these organisms are extremely invasive. And, once Brettanomyces sort of takes hold in certain areas of the brewery, it's extremely difficult to get rid of. And, people that are focused on clean ale and lager beer styles would have an entirely unmanageable nightmare on their hands if they got breath infections. So a lot of people stray from it, or you go whole hog like I and other people do. And but yeah, what inspired me to do it was kind of twofold. I had the good fortune of being able to travel to Belgium a couple times, and both times was kind of on my way into beer and like getting excited about drinking beer and making it. And I toured some of the traditional lambic breweries and blenderies in and around Brussels. And just the concept of this kind of very low-tech heritage process, kind of surrendering to letting nature take its course a little bit and then manipulating it a little bit after the fact to make, fun and interesting and complex beers, really, I just got really excited about it. And it is not logistically or financially feasible on the commercial side, particularly in American brewing. So it was never really like a totally viable idea until we fell sort of ass backwards into this building that we could live in and let, a 1 to 2 year production course take its course. That most people, like if you pitch that to investors, they'd be like, "You're crazy."
Sure.
So we just kind of happen to get lucky. And so it's modeled sort of after this traditional Belgian lambic brewing and blending.
Is that how they initially, like way back in the day, like were making beer? Is that like with wild yeast and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, historically, beer has been sour and wildly inoculated for much longer than it has been clean and drinkable. Even into like 17th and 18th century, like English pub culture, beer was blended on site. So they would have multiple casks behind the bar, and you could kind of pick and choose what you wanted, but you could get, to get a palatable beer without refrigeration or draft systems as we know them, bartenders would basically make beer cocktails of the really, acidic infected stuff with the fresh stuff, and you kind of get this blend of drinkable beer in real time.
Wow. Yeah, so you talk about like the like wild yeast and things like that sort of infecting a brewery, and that's why they stray away from it. So when you like put things in barrels and you are aging it, I'm assuming you just can't ever clean out all of the yeast that existed before that?
No, and you really don't want to in certain cases. You can kind of hit a microbiological lottery, if you will.
Sure.
If you pitch enough organisms and kind of let the sort of Darwinian process start to happen.
Yeah.
We had briefly touched on this earlier about like what is a brewery having a sense of place actually look, taste, smell like. And to me, it's the first beers out of the gate took a really long time to make, but they are amalgamations of known organisms, known wild, like lab cultured organisms. But eventually the stuff that are in these barrels and some of the wild stuff that I don't know what's in it, locally captured yeast, etc., they will start to take up residence in and outside the wood in our brewery, and they'll start to compete and develop sort of a house culture within each barrel and then kind of the environment itself. And eventually there will be a likeness of a house character as a result of all these different things kind of competing with each other to win out in certain barrels and certain areas of the brewery, things like that.
Because this might seem like a stupid question, but can they go from like one barrel to another barrel? Like, is it in the air or something?
Yeah. So all this stuff is airborne.
Wow.
Always has been. The very first beers that were ever created in life, tens of thousands of years ago, were wildly inoculated, they think, by bread makers who had a rainstorm or some way of getting a vat of bread or a storage, thing of bread wet, and then wild airborne yeast kind of inoculated that bread water, and they threw a party about it.
Yeah, because it's always interesting to me, and I think about this with a lot of things. Like the first time that they figured out how to do this, like people figured out how to do this, is like insane to me. Like
it is. I mean, think about that conversation. I've heard it told a couple ways where someone's like, "Can you imagine the town idiot who's like, I don't know, we should drink it."
Yeah.
And then they became, the god of beer or whatever.
Yeah, and also I think about this all the time when people are like, even with like berries and things like that, like how we know that they're poisonous. Like someone had to eat that to know that was poisonous. I just always think about that sort of stuff. But just to go back to you specifically, did you start brewing beer on like a homebrew level at Marquette? Is that when you first started actually like experimenting and trying?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I went to go visit a buddy who went to Michigan Tech my senior year at Marquette, and when we got there, they were fermenting beer in their college house, like basement.
Sure.
And at the time, it just like had blown my mind because I'd spent an extraordinary amount of time at Lakefront Brewery as a student, just taking the tour, because at the time it was $5 and you got a tour and some information and then like a fun time, and you got like generous pours, we'll say, without throwing them under the bus. It was a pretty
Sure.
good use of $5 as a college
Yeah.
student. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
And so when I saw these dudes making it in like these little plastic jugs, I was like, holy cow, I didn't think you could do that.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of like set it off. And I'd been like interested in beer, for a while leading up to that. I have a couple of like, sort of milestone, like beer awakening moments with certain beers that kind of got me down the path of trying different ones and kind of enjoying, tasting and trying all these different beers. But it wasn't until that point that I thought I could actually like make it and make it well.
What were some of those beers that were like milestone beers for you?
I have a first like memory of
Sure.
something in this, which is when the Bulls were about to have their first three-peat in '93. My neighborhood, I grew up on the north side of Chicago, and our block would throw these like yard parties where people would take their TVs and put them in the yard, and everyone would watch these Bulls games. And it was like electric. Like everyone showed up for these things. And I remember I was in like probably third grade, but I remember a neighbor bringing over a 6-pack of Goose Island Honkers Ale and putting it in like the yard cooler. And I remember then just being like, you can do that? Like, there is something besides MGD out there? That's insane.
Yeah.
And it was like cool looking, and there was like a goose on it. It was red. It was like, I remember, I think that's kind of what maybe even started my foray into like branding and packaging and advertising.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember seeing Honkers Ale as like a very small kid and being like, holy cow, like something different. That's cool. And then when I was in high school, and I kind of got bit by like the jam band bug.
Sure.
And I started going to fish shows and partaking in the lot scene beforehand and afterward.
Yeah.
And there was an abundance of Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. It was just kind of like the hippie beer at the time. It just like rocked my world. I was like, I cannot believe that beer can taste like this. It was like, then it was like intense and bitter and, interesting. And so, yeah, it just kind of opened my eyes to a totally different spectrum of flavor and those two specifically.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to touch on that too, because I think your branding is so awesome. I really love your logo and your branding. But what was the reaction when you first started home brewing and like making beer? Like, do you remember what was the first like beer that you brewed on on a serious basis and like gave it to people? And what was their reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I took it seriously out of the gate.
Okay.
But the result, you wouldn't really be able to tell that I took it that seriously. But like I cared about it, and I really had fun with it. But the first beer I ever brewed was actually kind of I bet if you asked like 10 brewers who used to be home brewers a good amount of them would say this. But I brewed an Irish red ale. It was an extract kit, and I just kind of like got going that way. It was the least cost and kind of equipment to entry to do it that way. I liked it. I remember liking it. I can actually remember what it tastes like. It wasn't very good, but I liked it. I would dump it down the drain today. And I think that's not uncommon either, but the response is funny. Like, this would have been, my first batch would have been like 2007 or 8. And then people are like, what? This brown bottle of beer is like, you made this? And so there's kind of like a disproportionate amount of, giving it the benefit of the doubt when people are drinking it, when they know you made it. A lot of people were pretty, nice about it. Of course, like out of the gate, people are like, wow, you should just do this for a living, which is kind of a funny dynamic that beer making has. Like, everyone thinks you should just do it as a career.
Yeah, like it's super easy to just go. You should just go do it. Yeah. No, that is funny, because it's funny when you give someone something that you created and you're just sort of standing there, that dynamic is pretty funny to me.
Well, and then it's like, well, what did you expect people to do? Like, rip it apart in front of you? Like, no, they might behind your back or whatever, but
yeah, once you walk away.
Sure.
Yeah. So you worked at Penrose Brewing Company, right, for like 4
Yes.
years. Was working for them, did that sort of lead you in a direction of like then wanting to like start drafting up and creating your own brewery even before you decided to come to Milwaukee and move up here?
It didn't sort of kind of inspire me to put pen to paper, so to speak, but I was getting an enormous amount of experience and perspective. So I joined that team before, well, basically during the build out. And so I had a chance to, literally see the whole start of things, kind of the genesis of things, and taste a lot of the R&D and test batches of those beers before they came out and were brewed on site.
Yeah.
And even just like what a build out looked like, infrastructure wise and planning wise, timeline wise, and permitting and all of that. And then what it like actually looked like to pour beer number one and get it up off the ground, and then establish a sales program and work with a distributor. And so I saw, the beginning and middle of what it actually took to start to finish, get a brewery up off the ground. And I was just kind of absorbing all that along the way without too much of an expectation of doing it myself, but certainly banking away, what I was seeing. I think a lot of people probably get into this thinking they have to be bigger than they actually do.
Yeah.
And, I know now that that's not only not what I want, but just not what we can do. What I want to do is just make small amounts of beer that I'm proud of, that can support the things we need to do to live our life in this place. And I don't want to get tied up in a bunch of the stuff that I've seen with other breweries who kind of outkick their coverage, as it were, and take on too much expectation. And I have a very clear understanding of just how big I actually need to be without getting over my skis.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I was listening to someone else talk the other day about this sort of topic too, of like when you start something, like their example was basketball. Like everybody wants to be Michael Jordan,
Sure. Yeah.
And everybody thinks that it's possible to be Michael Jordan, and that they'll be happiest if that's the case, if they're like the best player of all time in basketball.
Sure.
When in reality, you can have a lot of fun playing basketball and not be Michael Jordan. Like you could still really enjoy it and find your pocket of where it makes sense for you in your life.
And similarly, Michael Jordan didn't have a bed of roses about being Michael Jordan. I mean, the bigger and better and badder you get, and more known you get, and under more public eye you get, there's scaled responsibility and scaled detriment that comes with being that big and bad and good and popular. And I think agility, if we've learned anything during this pandemic, it's that agility is kind of king these days.
Yeah.
And, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. I'm comfortable being agile versus being like number one or best or biggest or, any of those superlatives. I'd rather just like be good and be proud of what I'm doing and run a good business and be in Bayview.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, because there's such a culture of that today. I feel like to be happy, you have to be the best of the best, or you have to be number one or whatever. And I just don't think that's the case at all. I think you can be happy just finding what you love to do and just do it at a level that you like to do it, and that's great.
Yeah, and I think there's a certain amount of living that has to be done to kind of at least be humble with yourself enough or honest with yourself enough to sort of recognize that, because I'm 36 now, and if I would have been pursuing this at 26, it would have looked entirely
for sure.
different.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
My priorities about what actually mattered would have been entirely different. And it just they would have been two fundamentally different businesses.
For sure. Yeah, I know. But I mean, I think that also says a lot about you, because some people never grow out of that. So I think everybody in their 20s is like, striving for the stars, which is great.
Totally.
But yeah, I think the growth is really what sets people apart from others, and some people are still chasing that into their 40s, which is unfortunate. But
it feels good to know where we're going, at least.
Yeah, have a general direction or something.
Generally.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to talk about because when I was reading about you talked about, and we talked about this a little bit too, you have like a hybrid approach to production.
Yeah.
I'm not a brewer, so I'm just interested to know, like, what does that mean in like the context of brewing? Like, what is a hybrid approach?
Yeah, it's not like a blanket term for anything. It's just sort of what I'm doing at the moment. The hybrid is that I do produce my own wort on site, in a very small system, typically like 2 barrels at a time, which is like the equivalent of 4 kegs. Because the majority of my production is in oak wine barrel vessels, and they range from 225 liters to 500 liters, which is upwards of 110, 120 or whatever gallons at a time. It doesn't make sense for me financially, fiscally, logistically to pull 12-hour brew days from mash in to clean up to make 1 wine barrel full of beer. Once we have our tap room up and running, I can turn 2 barrel batches of clean beer and more efficient beer, still, obviously very intentional, flavorful beer, but at that scale, that makes sense for what I'm really trying to do in terms of building like a oak barrel blending inventory. It makes more sense for me to write a recipe and work with a brewer who has a much larger capacity than I do in town to give the recipe to them, produce it, fill up a vessel with it, and I take it back from them, fill all my barrels and pitch my organisms, and then take the process basically all the way through packaging. Sure. So I've worked with a couple of breweries, but most recently, and probably for the foreseeable future, I'll be working with Third Space.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've been there. They're great.
Yeah, they're outstanding. And they are true like stewards of the trade. They're pros. They're extremely dialed in, extremely professional, and their investment in professionalism is in a lot of their equipment and people, and they have the ability to produce the highest quality possible wort that I could ask for. So I know that when I'm working with them, I'm getting stuff that is probably higher quality than I could do on 2 barrel turns on my own.
Sure. So talking about like that sense of place and sort of the yeast combining to sort of give, I guess, all of the beer that you create this sort of distinct sense of where it's coming from. How long does that take to happen? Has that already happened?
No, it's definitely on its way. And the basic at a basic level, it's when you start using these barrels second, third, fourth times that things start to kind of hash themselves out a little bit. And about half of my barrel stock is on its second turn at this point. And so I'll just keep building, barrel stock, doing first turns, second turns, kind of blending them, and it'll start to happen over time. But some of the beers that will be coming out this summer are products of that kind of fine tuning of at least barrel character into something consistent.
Gotcha. And then does that also sort of combine with the idea of using like more local ingredients and stuff to tie with your beers in your brewing?
Yeah, that's kind of the second leg of that. So the one is sort of the survival of the fittest kind of house flavor development at a microbiological level, and then the other one is much more at like a visible macro level with working with local farms and knowing where our fruit comes from. Some people like to say that's sort of an over romanticized endeavor. But for me, living in Wisconsin, it's actually easier, cheaper, better than any other solution. And it's real, like I don't have to mess with syrups or concentrates or fake, manufactured things. I can go to Lakeview Berry Farm and buy 1,000 pounds of raspberries from the guy who picked them, or go pick them myself, which I might actually do this year with the kid and my wife. We might make a little day of it. So for our scale too, I recognize that for other breweries, that actually doesn't make sense because, sliding scales being what they are, my 1,000 pounds of raspberries could be somebody's 30,000 pounds of raspberries, and that doesn't make sense either.
Yeah. No, I that's like one of my favorite parts of fall in Wisconsin is like picking apples and stuff like that. I love that stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff is world class. I mean, Door County cherries are like, they're it,
Yeah.
And they're beautiful and tasty, and I can go and pick them up in one day like I did this past year, and the day after they were harvested. Having a sense of place is definitely sort of an ideal or like a virtue that we want to focus on, but it's also it's logistically easy to buy this stuff from the farmers who grow it close by.
Yeah, no, and I can guarantee you that they appreciate it. I actually just talked to a farmer 2 weeks ago, and that episode will come out soon. But yeah, they heavily appreciate that, and people that are willing to locally come and get their produce and stuff. But yeah, it's that's a great thing for sure for not only for you, because it's like, as you said, logistically easier, but it's great for the community at large. I think it's awesome that you're doing that. Yeah.
I mean, I think if we can keep the money closer to home, almost in literally any case, the better we'll all be.
Yeah, I think it's just people don't, especially even in Wisconsin, I think you just don't think necessarily that because it gets so cold that there is this awesome amount of fresh produce from farmers around Wisconsin. There's so much good stuff being grown there.
It's incredible. And, the unexpected side of that is on the wine grape side, and these like cold weather, kind of like hardier grapes. That, the Midwest isn't like wine country by any means, but there's really excellent wine being produced in Wisconsin and Michigan, and a lot of these like cold weather varietals that I'm just learning about, but I'm excited to use in beer this upcoming season. They don't get a lot of love, but they're there and they're awesome. So
where does the name Supermoon come from? Like, where did that originate from?
When we were thinking about kind of after Maria was like, you got to consider this. I was like, all right, well, what does this look like? Like, we live here and it's not a brewery yet. And here's kind of if we were taking advantage of the good fortune of falling into this building, like how would we approach making, building like an oak cellar and doing a blending project, and started to do like early iterations of business planning and figured that didn't make sense to be open like a, 5-day-a-week type of a thing, or even a tap room. It was more about purposefully kind of blending some beers together, building up that barrel stock, building up that house character. And the way that worked out, hey buddy, it was is that we would be doing kind of quarterly beer releases.
Sure.
And so there was something in this sort of analogy that started to happen where it was like, in a year there's like 12 or 13 full moons, and just like a handful of them are supermoons. And when that does happen, the moon is brighter and more vibrant and complex and more interesting, more captivating than the standard moons that happen all the time. Gotcha. And so sort of this like production metaphor of like the things we're going to be releasing are, on a surface level, more interesting, complex than just like everything else that you drink every day. It's not supposed to be your everyday beer. It's more of an occasion beer. So the pacing of Supermoon kind of made sense. And then when we started to explore designs, so when you ferment with wild organisms or acid producing organisms in oak or really anything, there is this biofilm that tends to form on the top, on like the surface level of the liquid that's fermenting.
Sure.
And that's called a pellicle. And the pellicles are all unique. None look like the same every time. And they kind of like bubble up, and they have this sort of surface that remarkably resembles kind of a lunar surface. Okay, sure. So when you look inside of a barrel, you see like what looks like the surface of the moon. And so we kind of combined those two metaphors, and that's why our logo looks the way it does. It kind of resembles a pellicle.
Is that, I saw one of the pictures on your Instagram from like October. Is that what that is?
Yeah, that's what that is.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It literally does look like the moon.
Yeah, it's nuts. There's a yeast lab, one of the best in the world, honestly, called White Labs, and they do a thing called Pellicle Monday on Instagram, and it's just all these nerds that take pictures of their pellicles and hashtag them, and then White Labs will like highlight a pellicle.
Wow.
So if you're interested, you should take a look. I mean, you could kind of get a good idea for how kind of what an insane range of pellicles look like, and kind of how cool they are, and that there's like way more happening inside that barrel than anybody typically cares about.
Have you ever submitted yours for that?
I have. I did. I think I submitted that one that you're referencing, actually.
Oh, yeah.
I thought it was a pretty cool one. It didn't get picked up, but
no, that is a cool one. I mean, I don't have reference of what other ones look like at this point, but I mean, I think it looks pretty cool.
Yeah.
No, that's really awesome. I think that's something that everyone should take a look at, because I don't think people normally would imagine that that's inside. Is it the coloring on the photo, or is it actually black like that, or dark?
Yeah, it's like it looks like a kind of a dusty white.
Yeah.
Sort of a, I don't know what to compare it to without getting too gross. But like when you make like pasta and it starts bubbling over, it kind of looks like that.
Yeah, it's crazy that natural organisms can sort of make that happen.
Yeah, and the beauty of that, there's a lot of debate about this piece of the pellicle puzzle, but because there's a lot that people don't know about them, honestly.
Yeah.
But one thing that it does functionally is that, so oxygen is mostly an enemy of beer post-fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
And in my case, it is detrimental to preventing acid production where I don't want it, or inviting acid-producing organisms that I don't want, like Acetobacter, into the equation. And the pellicle actually acts as a barrier to block the oxygen from coming through the top of the barrel or the bunghole into the liquid. So it blankets the entire surface area of the top of the liquid from being exposed to oxygen.
So it's actually trying to help you, basically.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Wow, that's really cool.
Which is also why we don't sample through the top of the barrel, because we don't want to poke a hole in the pellicles. So that's, if you see people's barrel cellars and you see nails in the center of the barrel, it's so you can pull a nail out and take a sample of the liquid below the pellicle line. Is it?
We're getting really in depth on the pellicle talk, but it's just really interesting to me. So is it like, could you, if like, and theoretically, if I put my hands under the pellicle somehow, could I lift it up and it would like stay as one sheet?
No, I think it'd be more like a swamp slime kind of scenario.
I gotcha.
But if you can do that, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try. I'll give it a go. I'll ruin a couple barrels of beer, but it's worth it.
If I have a bad one, you and I can try and do it.
That would be really cool, actually. Yeah. But yeah, so you sort of talked about this briefly, but do you have any? Because like, there's a huge amount of collaboration in like the brewery scene, and you sort of talked about it with Third Space too. Do you plan on doing like collaborations, or have you done them with other breweries in the Milwaukee area?
Yeah. I actually have one in the works. I'm pretty pumped about. This past Tuesday, I went to my old brewery, Penrose, and we brewed a beer that I trucked back across state lines, and I'm fermenting as we speak. Nice. And not a year ago, probably 9 months ago, last October, Kyle Vetter and I at 1840 and Tyler, his brewer, made some beer together. That beer fermented stainless clean, and I have since put it into barrels with some Brett strains, and it's in a really nice place, and it's gearing up to probably be ready this summer, potentially like June or July. Cool. Yeah, that's one locally that I'm pretty pumped about, that we'll be having pretty soon here.
Yeah, I've had Kyle on the podcast. He's awesome.
Yeah, I listened to that episode. That was great.
Yeah, he's super cool, and I love his beer too. Is one of my favorites in Milwaukee, probably.
Yeah,
So,
he did a lot of the groundwork of kind of establishing that experience for people and like just getting barrel fermented and barrel aged beer more regularly in people's hands. So I very much appreciate kind of what he's brought to the scene.
So, I mean, since you do a more unique style, this is just for other people too that haven't tried it before. Since it's not sort of like, as you said, what normal, like what you'd expect for like a Pilsner or something.
Sure.
What is like the palate? I know all of them are different probably, but like what is the palate expectation? Is it more like fruity and things like that? Or what sort of notes usually come through when you use like wild yeast in the way you do it?
Yeah, if we're talking about 100% Britannomyces yeast fermented beers in barrels, which is the majority of what we do, I like to start with just funk, like, in a taxonomy sort of a perspective. These are farmhouse styles of beer. They have a certain kind of like a pastoral nature to them that are funkier, earthier, just kind of out of the gate. But there's there's a infinite amount of strains of these organisms that we could be using. The ones that I intentionally am using range from anything from like really bright tropical fruit like pineapple, papaya, guava, mango, to really intense, funkier, bitter, earthier flavors like leather, like wet soil. So there's a whole range of what they do under certain conditions and certain ages and certain environments inside the barrel cellar itself. So that's where tasting and sampling and blending kind of net out.
Gotcha. Yeah. So with all this, like, where can people find out more about Supermoon Beer Company, and where can people like follow you to see updates? Because how are you guys doing it right now with the whole pandemic situation currently?
Yeah, right. I mean, right now we're sticking to this kind of quarterly bottle release model, and people can find out, kind of track what we're doing. I'm probably most active on Instagram, but our website has most of the info you could need, and you could subscribe to our email list, which is where I typically first share any sorts of information about upcoming beers or release dates. Sure. So that's kind of the best way to stay in touch. What was I going to say? Oh, pretty soon we're actually going to be pursuing our tap room. So we had an architect come to the building a couple weeks ago, and we've got our first round of build out plans. So I'll be sharing kind of some details along the way as we sort of get that underway.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, before we go here, your Instagram handle is Supermoon Beer Co. if people want to follow you.
Yeah, that's it.
And is the website the same as well?
It's supermoonbeer.com.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Dude, thanks so much. This was really cool, and I had fun doing it. It was awesome.
Yeah, I know how busy you are, so I appreciate it. I'm glad your son got a cameo in his first ever podcast too.
Yeah, I'll have some making up to do about that. He doesn't look thrilled.
Yeah, I bet.
That was awesome.
Well, thank you so much, man, and have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.